Do you believe that one of the most talked about countries on Earth is also one of the least understood? A place where millions of people wake up every morning, make coffee, argue about which neighborhood has the best espresso, take their kids to school, fall in love, build things, and live lives that the rest of the world almost never actually sees. A country that most people feel like they already know because they've seen it on the news. But what's on the news and what actually exists on the ground are two completely different things. Today we're going inside Ukraine, not the Ukraine of breaking alerts and political commentary, the real one. The one with medieval monasteries carved directly into cliffs, cities where Soviet brutalist towers stand 3 blocks from rooftop jazz bars, farmers who work soil so rich that scientists travel from across the world just to study it, and a tech industry that quietly built products used by hundreds of millions of people globally before most of the world even knew it existed. A country where strangers invite you in for food before they know your name, and where underneath everything that's been happening, there's a quality of life, a culture, a way of being that the outside world has almost completely failed to see. And the question that keeps coming back throughout all of it is this: who are these people really? What does daily life here actually feel like from the inside? And what does the world keep getting wrong about a place it thinks it understands? Ukraine is the largest country located entirely within Europe. That single fact surprises people almost every time. Most people imagine it as something smaller, more peripheral, but the numbers tell a different story. It stretches across more than 600,000 square kilometers, larger than France, larger than Spain. And within those borders, there's a geographic and cultural range that almost no one outside the region expects. Start in the west. The Carpathian Mountains rise in the country's western corner in a way that immediately destroys the mental image most people carry of what Ukraine looks like. These aren't sharp, dramatic peaks like the Alps. They're older, softer, covered in dense forest that seems to absorb sound. Villages up in these mountains look like they were built slowly over centuries without any particular urgency, because they were. Wooden churches with hand-carved facades sit at the edges of fields where fog settles every morning and burns off by 10. Some of these communities still practice crafts that predate the concept of a nation-state. Embroidery patterns that encode information about where a family comes from. Wood carving traditions passed between generations with the same natural ease that other people pass down last names. Then move east and the country transforms completely. The steppe opens up in a way that genuinely stops people. Flat in every direction, the sky becomes enormous. The horizon seems to curve slightly at the edges on clear days. In summer, the sunflower fields stretch so far that the color yellow stops registering as a color and starts feeling like something the air is made of. This isn't decoration or folklore. Ukraine produces between 40 and 45% of the world's sunflower oil. That figure quietly shapes what's on the shelf at grocery stores across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. Most people eating breakfast have no idea. Then the South. The Black Sea coast, and specifically Odessa, has a character entirely its own. Crumbling neoclassical buildings with wrought iron balconies leaning slightly in different directions. A port that has received ships from dozens of countries for several centuries. Wide stone staircases that descend toward water that turns different colors depending on the hour. In summer, the beaches fill with people who move, like the concept of urgency is something they heard about once and chose not to adopt. And then there's Kyiv. The first time someone arrives in Kyiv, the expectations are almost always wrong. The mental image most people carry from the outside is either historical, golden domes, ancient cathedrals, or urgent and recent, rarely present tense. But the city itself is very much present tense. Kyiv is built on hills above the Dnipro River. That geography alone gives it a drama that flat cities simply don't have. You're constantly moving up or down. Stairs cut between streets at unexpected angles. There are funiculars still running on the steeper sections of the older districts. And at certain points, standing on the edge of the upper city, looking out over the river and the lower bank, stretching away into green haze in summer. It genuinely doesn't look like what the news has trained people to picture. The city center holds some of the oldest surviving structures in the entire Slavic world. St. Sophia Cathedral was built in the 11th century. The mosaics inside it were laid by Byzantine craftsmen brought specifically from Constantinople for the purpose. The gold surfaces have been reflecting light for nearly 1,000 years. The building survived the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. It survived occupation, revolution, the Soviet era, during which it was officially converted into a museum to prevent it functioning as a place of worship. It is still there, still intact, still doing what it was built to do. Outside 3 blocks away, there's a specialty coffee shop with Colombian single-origin beans and a line of young professionals out the door on a Tuesday morning. The escalator at the nearest metro station descends several floors underground, past chandeliers and marble floors and ceiling murals that belong in a state gallery. These metro stations were built with a kind of monumental civic ambition that seems extravagant until you realize the city is genuinely proud of them and uses them constantly. That combination keeps surprising visitors, the ancient and the very current, sitting next to each other with no apparent tension. One of the first things people notice in Ukrainian cities is how much attention people pay to being in public. Not formally dressed, not stiff or ceremonial, but considered, intentional, as if going outside is worth making an effort for. It takes a few days to understand that this isn't vanity. It's something closer to a quiet insistence that ordinary days deserve a certain dignity. The food signals the same thing. Ukrainian cuisine doesn't try to position itself or get rediscovered or trend. It's just very deeply, straightforwardly good. Borscht, which the rest of the world knows vaguely as a beet soup from somewhere in this region, has so many regional variations inside Ukraine itself that ordering it in 2 different cities can produce 2 genuinely different dishes. In one place, it's dark and thick and rich, served with a heavy spoonful of smetana, a sour cream that nothing else quite replicates. Somewhere else, it's lighter and sweeter, built on a different foundation entirely. People argue about which version is correct with an intensity that suggests the outcome actually matters. Varodniki appear at nearly every table. Dumplings filled with potato and cheese, or sour cherry, or meat, or sauerkraut, depending on the region and the season and whose kitchen you're in. They're shaped by hand in most households. The technique is something grandmothers teach granddaughters in kitchens that carry the same smell those kitchens had 50 years ago. In a climate where cold is serious, fat is fuel. Once the initial unfamiliarity passes, the flavor turns out to be its own reward. Food here isn't decoration, and it isn't performance. When someone in Ukraine feeds you, they're communicating something about who they are and where they come from. And the invitation comes quickly. The threshold between stranger and guest in this culture is much shorter than in many others. Not because Ukrainians are unusually loud or demonstrative, but because offering food to someone is simply the natural next step after meeting them, and there's no reason to delay it. All of this, the texture of daily life, the physical city, the food, the way people move through public space, is something that gets almost completely lost in the way Ukraine is typically discussed from the outside. The version that most of the world sees is real, but it's also genuinely incomplete. Both things are true at the same time. The difficult reality is real, and so is everything else. To understand why Ukraine is the way it is now, you need to go back. Not because history is the only lens worth using, but because in Ukraine, history is unusually unfinished. It shows up in conversations, in arguments between generations, in the names being given to streets, in the language people choose when they have a choice to make. It's something people here are still actively working through together, out loud. The story of Kyiv as a political and cultural center begins in the 9th century. What historians call Kyivan Rus was a confederation of Slavic peoples centered on this city on the Dnipro. And at its peak, it controlled territory stretching from what is now northern Russia down through the steppes. When Prince Volodymyr converted to Christianity in 988 and ordered the mass baptism of Kyiv's population in the river, a moment that is depicted in enormous murals across the country to this day, he was making a decision that would shape the architectural, philosophical, and cultural character of the entire region for over 1,000 years. St. Sophia Cathedral was built in the 11th century under Yaroslav the Wise, Volodymyr's son. It was meant to rival the great churches of Constantinople, and by some measures, it succeeded. Byzantine craftsmen laid the mosaics. The proportions were borrowed from the most sophisticated architectural tradition available at the time. Walking through it today, knowing what it survived, produces a feeling that's hard to describe without sounding melodramatic, but the building earns it. Then there are the Cossacks. From roughly the 15th century onward, the Cossacks of the Zaporizhian steppes developed a culture built on several principles that would become central to how Ukrainians understand themselves: military effectiveness, personal freedom, fierce resistance to external authority. Their society was organized differently from the noble hierarchies that dominated the rest of Europe at the time. A man standing within it depended on what he could do, not who his father was. This wasn't a minor detail. It created a cultural mythology around self-determination and earned status that is still visible in how Ukrainians talk about themselves and their history. The Cossack leader Bohdan Khmelnytsky is on the currency. His statue stands in the center of Kyiv's main square, pointing east with a confidence that the pose has been carrying for decades. Whether historians assess his legacy as cleanly heroic or considerably more complicated is a discussion that continues. But within Ukrainian national memory, he represents a specific idea: that this land has its own story, not merely a chapter appended to someone else's. Then came the long period of being governed by others. The Russian Empire absorbed most of Ukrainian territory across the 18th century. Austro-Hungary controlled the western regions, including Lviv, which developed a distinctly different character as a result, more Central European in its architecture, its cafe culture, its relationship to languages and borders. Under Russian imperial rule, the Ukrainian language was repeatedly restricted. At certain points, it was officially banned from publishing, from education, from public use. The argument used to justify this was that Ukrainian was merely a dialect of Russian, not a real language in its own right. The people whose language it was never accepted that argument, but acceptance wasn't required for enforcement. The 20th century brought catastrophes of a scale that are genuinely difficult to absorb. The Holodomor, the famine of 1932 and 1933, was the result of Soviet grain requisition policies that stripped Ukrainian farmers of everything they had grown, including what they needed to survive the winter. The death toll is estimated between 3 and 5 million people. Some villages lost the majority of their population. The survivors were left with a relationship to food, to storage, to the earth beneath their feet, and to centralized authority that their descendants can still articulate clearly. The habit of preserving food, of keeping a stocked cellar, of growing something in any available patch of ground is not purely tradition in Ukraine. It carries memory. The jar of pickled tomatoes on the basement shelf, the dried herbs hung from the ceiling beam, the insistence on canning every autumn even when the grocery store is fully stocked. These habits were formed by people who learned in the most direct possible way that supply cannot be assumed. The Second World War followed immediately. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine declared independence on August 24th. In the referendum that followed on December 1st, more than 90% of voters across the country chose independence. That percentage held even in regions that would later become contested. Historians have been noting the consistency of that vote ever since. Independence brought enormous difficulty alongside freedom. The economy contracted sharply. Institutions built for a different system didn't function well in the new one. Corruption became structural at almost every level. Ordinary people who had spent the 20th century with very little control over their circumstances found themselves navigating a different kind of precariousness in the 1990s. Savings disappeared when the currency collapsed. Pensions became nearly worthless. The gap between the promise of independence and its immediate reality was wide and painful. But something else was also happening at the same time, at the level of everyday choices. Ukrainians were beginning, slowly, to work out who they were on their own terms, what the language actually was, what history meant, and whose version of it was true, what kind of country they wanted to build, if they were going to build one. The language question is one of the most misread aspects of Ukraine from outside. For most of the Soviet period, Russian functioned as the dominant language in cities, especially in the east and center. This was the product of policy, not of organic cultural preference. After independence, the balance began shifting gradually. Kyiv, which had been functionally Russian-speaking through much of the 20th century, became increasingly Ukrainian over the following decades. Not because anyone was forced, because people were making choices. Young parents choosing to speak Ukrainian to children they were raising to be something different from what their parents had been. Writers switching languages mid-career. Businesses advertising differently. The change was quiet, generational, and consistent. Since 2014, and moving considerably faster since 2022, That shift has accelerated in ways that have been documented repeatedly. Ukrainians who spent their entire lives speaking Russian as their primary language have switched to Ukrainian and describe it not as a political act, but as an identity decision, a choice about which story they belong to. That distinction matters. It explains something the outside world has struggled to interpret. This is not a simple picture. Ukraine has genuine linguistic and regional diversity. Crimean Tatars have their own language and their own history of persecution, including a Soviet-era deportation that removed the entire population from their homeland. Hungarian, Romanian, and Bulgarian communities in the West and Southwest maintain their own languages and cultural identities. The country has never been the uniform bloc that simplified coverage tends to present. But within all of that diversity, something holds. A broadly shared sense of what independence means. A broadly shared attachment to the right to exist on one's own terms. And a broadly shared willingness to defend both. The culture makes this complexity visible in ways worth paying attention to. The traditional bandura, a large stringed instrument with a resonance unlike anything else in European music, shares cultural space with polyphonic folk singing traditions that UNESCO has included on its list of intangible cultural heritage. Right next to those ancient forms, there's a music scene in Kyiv and Lviv that was drawing international attention before 2022 for reasons that had nothing to do with conflict. Electronic, hip-hop, post-punk, music made in Ukrainian, sometimes mixing languages, working through identity in real time through sound. The vyshyvanka, the embroidered shirt, is one of the clearest examples of how old cultural forms get lived rather than archived in Ukraine. The patterns are regional. Each one encodes something specific about where it came from, and those patterns have been showing up on streetwear and album covers and architectural installations and phone cases. Not because anyone organized a revival campaign, because young people reached for them on their own. There's a version of Ukraine that never appears in any news cycle, and it's the version where most of life happens. The morning commuter in the Kyiv metro pressing his face slightly away from the person beside him, the way people do in subways everywhere. The pharmacist in Lviv, who stays an extra half hour after closing to help an elderly customer understand a new prescription. The software developer in Kharkiv, who is on deadline for a client in Berlin and takes lunch at the same cafe every day because the soup is exactly right. The farmer in Poltava, whose grandfather worked the same field and whose son, after getting a computer science degree, came back to help modernize the operation. These are not dramatic stories. They are the actual texture of a country with 40 million people, and they reveal something important about a place that's usually discussed only in terms of crisis. Ukraine's economy before the current period began was already a study in contrast that most outside observers had either not noticed or not found interesting enough to write about. On one side, the land. The Chernozem, the black soil of the Ukrainian steppe, is some of the most fertile earth on the planet. Scientists measure soil quality partly through organic carbon content, and Ukrainian Chernozem consistently places near the top of global comparisons. This isn't accident or mythology. It's geology, climate, and thousands of years of ecosystem development working together. Ukraine produces enormous quantities of wheat, corn, barley, rapeseed, and sunflowers. Before 2022, it was consistently among the top 5 wheat exporters in the world and was a primary grain supplier to countries across Africa and the Middle East. When that supply chain was disrupted, food prices in countries far from Ukraine rose measurably. The connection was direct and largely invisible until it wasn't. The paradox is that while the land is extraordinarily productive, the agricultural sector itself has been deeply contested territory in Ukrainian politics and economics since independence. Who owns the land? Who benefits from it? How it's managed? These questions have been central to every major political conflict the country has experienced. Large agribusinesses control enormous tracts. Small farmers operate with limited support and limited leverage. This tension is not abstract. It shows up in village economies where young people leave, not because there's nothing to do, but because there's no realistic path to building something of their own on land their families have worked for generations. And then there's the entirely different side of the economy, the technology sector. This is consistently the piece that surprises people most when they first encounter it. Ukraine before 2022 had become a genuine software development and technology hub with a depth that wasn't widely reported outside specialist circles. The country produced an unusually high number of computer science graduates annually. Technical education, a legacy of heavy Soviet investment in engineering and applied sciences, remained strong and serious long after independence. And the combination of relatively lower cost of living with a highly skilled workforce created conditions where developers and engineers could build competitive careers without the pressure that defines places like San Francisco or London. Major global companies used Ukrainian development teams. Individual developers worked remotely for clients across North America, Europe, and Asia. Startups were founded, funded, and scaled. Grammarly, the writing assistance tool with several 100 million users globally, was founded by Ukrainians. GitLab, the platform used for code collaboration by hundreds of thousands of software teams worldwide, was co-founded by a Ukrainian. Luxury, the technology that became the engine behind Snapchat's face filters, was built in Kharkiv. These are not isolated examples collected to make a point. They reflect an ecosystem that had developed genuine depth over a decade and a half of consistent investment and talent development. By the late 2000s, Kyiv's technology district was a working startup community. Office buildings that had previously housed Soviet-era industrial operations were being converted. Venture capital was moving in. The demographic driving it was young, internationally connected, in building things that had no precedent in Ukrainian economic history. A country simultaneously rooted in one of the oldest forms of production, farming soil that has been cultivated for millennia, and plugged into the most current forms of global economic activity. These two worlds didn't conflict. They coexisted, often in the same family. Daily life in Ukrainian cities had settled by the late 2000s and 10s into rhythms that felt from the inside like ordinary urban life in any middle-income European country with its own distinct character. Coffee culture had become specific and seriously taken. Specialty shops with particular attention to origin, roasting method, and preparation technique were everywhere in Kyiv by 2019. People cared about this in the way that signals genuine cultural investment rather than trend following. Debates about which neighborhood had the best espresso were real debates with real stakes. The restaurant culture had expanded rapidly through that decade. Traditional Ukrainian cuisine was being revisited by chefs who wanted to reinterpret what they'd grown up eating rather than replace it. The borscht their grandmothers made became source material for something that kept the memory and changed the presentation. Georgian food, which has deep historical and gustatory connections to Ukrainian palates, was everywhere. And alongside all of it, the street food never went away. The pierogi from carts near metro stations, the corn grilled on portable fires in summer parks, the things that taste like Tuesday and childhood, and the specific smell of a particular season. Parks were full in warm months. The culture of using public space, of gathering in large informal groups in green areas, of being outside for no structured reason, runs through Ukrainian urban life with a consistency that contrasts with more privatized versions of leisure. Hydro Park, an island in the Dnipro connected to Kyiv by a metro line, fills with thousands of people on summer weekends. Not tourists, not organized events, just people from the city. Families, teenagers, old men at permanent chess tables, people sunbathing and reading and paddling boats, living Saturday the way Saturday is supposed to work. Physical culture strengthened through that decade in visible ways. Outdoor gyms appeared in parks. Running became a real hobby, not a fringe one. The Kyiv Marathon grew consistently year after year. Cycling infrastructure expanded in the city. These are small details individually, but collectively, they signal something about a society's relationship to its own future. People investing in their physical lives are people who believe there's a future to invest in. Hospitality in Ukraine runs deep, and it expresses itself in specific ways. The concept of hosting here goes beyond offering refreshments. There's an expectation that a guest will be genuinely received, that their comfort will be actively tended to, that leaving them to manage independently would be a failure of the host's responsibility. This isn't heavy-handed, it's warm. It means that visits carry weight in both directions. You're not dropping by, you're being received. And the experience of being received this way, especially if you're coming from a more arm's-length culture, is genuinely disorienting in the best sense. Family structures remain close in ways that contrast with Northern and Western European patterns. Multi-generational living is common. Grandparents are not peripheral figures in Ukrainian families. They are often the organizing center of practical daily life. The babusia, the grandmother, is the person who cooks, who remembers, who knows which remedy works for which ailment, who has kept the connection to everything that came before. The exchange between generations is constant and substantive. Adult children support aging parents as a given, not as a burden. Grandparents invest enormously in grandchildren. The obligations run in both directions without being stated. This family structure is part of what has allowed Ukrainian society to absorb extreme stress without complete social fragmentation. When people are displaced, families move together. When resources become scarce, they're shared within the network. When someone needs help, the network already exists and already knows how to function. The social infrastructure is built into relationships rather than outsourced to institutions. This turns out to matter enormously when institutions are under strain. And then there's humor. Ukrainian humor is dark, dry, and specifically aimed at the absurdity of catastrophic situations. It's not escapism. It's a survival technology. The ability to make a joke about something terrible is the ability to maintain just enough distance from it to keep functioning. Ukrainians have been doing this for a long time because there has been substantial material. The internet accelerated it into something globally visible. Memes turned out political events and military confrontations into objects of irony with remarkable speed. The reflex is not cynicism. It's a deeply rooted cultural habit of finding the ridiculous embedded inside the terrible and using that finding as a handhold. When Ukraine's daily life was completely upended by massive displacement in 2022, conventional logic predicted social collapse. Instead, strong, pre-existing community networks activated. Without waiting for top-down institutional direction, strangers housed and fed one another, proving the profound durability of a culture that has never fully outsourced mutual care. This decentralized resilience was visible everywhere. Volunteers coordinated massive food networks, and cities swiftly adapted. Cultural life continued. Coffee shops stayed open, and the tech sector simply packed its laptops, seamlessly maintaining operations for international clients and keeping the knowledge economy alive under pressure. The famous 2022 meme of a Ukrainian farmer towing a military vehicle perfectly captures the national reflex, a blend of dark humor, practical ties to the land, and a deep-seated talent for improvisation. This same spirit drives their ongoing rebuilding efforts. Fueled by a cultural preference for action over bureaucratic waiting, communities are restoring schools and infrastructure in months rather than years. For decades, the outside world has underestimated Ukraine, reducing it to a former Soviet province or focusing only on its struggles. In reality, it possesses profound cultural depth and sophistication. Its serious literature, internationally recognized cinema, multi-layered architecture, and complex food traditions are the hard-won products of a civilization that has been building, losing, and rebuilding itself over a millennium.
Today, there is an urgent, concentrated energy focused on defining the country's future. Young Ukrainians studying abroad are even returning home, trading comparative comfort for the chance to make a tangible impact on the nation they are shaping for the next generation. Ultimately, Ukraine redefines what a country is, not merely bureaucratic borders, but a shared, resilient understanding of what matters. Those who truly spend time there are struck by its earned identity, its genuine warmth, and a culture that plays a much longer game in its relationship to time and survival. Looking past the loud headlines leaves us questioning what we thought we knew. Ukraine is not, and never has been, a simple place. But on closer inspection, it is, and always has been, a genuinely remarkable one. If this gave you something to think about, if you've ever looked at a place in the news and wondered what the real version looks like, then consider subscribing. Every week we go somewhere new, and we try every time to find the version that doesn't make the front page, the one where people are just living. See you in the next one.